I know. Okay, and we are live. What is today? May the 3rd, which means tomorrow is May the 4th for all the Star Wars nerds out there. When the podcast comes out, there we go. Ryan Ray alongside the good doctor herself, Dr. Ellen Wald. Miss Wald, how was your weekend?
Weekend was great. I baked my low carbon intensity gluten-free crackers, which I'm gonna be the first to admit were absolutely disgusting. So I'd go with the high carbon, carbon intensity gluten-free crackers.
That's funny. Well, we went fishing, and so went to Lake Whitney, about an hour east of where I live, and caught a bunch of fish. So I don't know if that's carbon neutral or carbon negative or what that is. I have no idea.
Mm.
How
Did
we
you
had a
buy fish offsets?
No, but we released most of the fish that we caught, so we gave back. We did keep
Okay.
some, but so there it is. So, but yeah, so I had a good weekend, and it was cold though. It's finally warming up. It's going to be like 86 here today, but it was cold this weekend. So
Mm.
maybe we're finally getting out of the global cooling phase here in Texas and global warming. Well, let's get into the show. This has got to be the first time the San Francisco Examiner has made an appearance on the podcast. I don't think I've ever even heard of this publication, but Miss Wald is a frequent reader, I suppose. Eliminating natural gas and housing could cost 5.9 billion. Oh, you know what? I should have put this in here. Did you see the story real quick about how they're changing what you can burn in your fireplace in England?
No. Really? What can you not burn? Like, don't burn what? Peat? People?
I was see if I.
Cow dung?
uh, Make sure I'm not dreaming this. I think it's like. Anyways, go ahead. Talk about this story. I'll find the story in England.
Yeah, so this story is kind of like a follow-up to something that actually happened earlier, I think last year, which is when San Francisco decided to ban natural gas hookups in all new construction. And there's actually a lot of pushback from the restaurant population because they're like, we need our natural gas stoves because like that's where all the good cooking happens. Of course, now I guess nobody's listening to the restaurants because they're probably all out of business in San Francisco. But what's interesting, and I actually think I wrote about that when it happened, and looking at San Francisco's energy sources, they get most of their electricity. I think it's like 60% of San Francisco's electricity comes from the damming of Hetch Hetchy, which was, I think, which was a very, very beautiful place. And then they dammed it and it filled in Hetch Hetchy Valley. And it's always been controversial because, yes, it provides a great water source and electricity, but it destroyed an incredible natural habitat. I think John Muir said, I think he described it as, what's the quote? Let's see. I think the quote is, he called it one of nature's rarest and most precious mountain temples. That was John Muir for you. Anyway, now apparently they're looking at getting rid of existing natural gas hookups to and electrify. I love how they use the word electrify homes because whenever I think of electrify, I think I think of electrocuting,
Right.
but they actually mean just convert from natural gas power to electricity. So they put together a commission to study this, a budget analyst report. And the supervisor said, there's no way, they said, first of all, there's no way the city can meet its climate goals if they don't do this because they hope to be net zero carbon by 2045. But apparently they think it will cost a whopping total of $5.9 billion. It's a billion with a
B.
B. Yeah.
Billion.
So what's also interesting, and that kind of ties into another article we have, which is about Wyoming, which is basically trying to like back up their coal industry. And one of the interesting things that they say in this is that a lot of West Coast states and Colorado are very like anti-coal and try to block the proliferation of coal, and yet
Mhm.
they still get power
Right.
from Wyoming, from
Right.
coal-fired power plants in Wyoming. So
Right.
like when the wind's not blowing or whatever, or they're running out, they rely on energy transmitted from Wyoming, which gets it from coal. So it's like everyone seems to think that it's this like holy grail if you just electrify everything. And the truth is that if you're, you know, they're not going to be able to get 60%. You know, if you convert all the buildings in San Francisco to electric heat and cooling, then you're going to need more electricity. You're going to end up relying more on Wyoming's coal-fired plants because you can't get more out of the Hetch Hetchy Dam. So, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to put more solar panels in? Where's the land for that? Where's the land for the wind? Are you going to build a nuclear plant? I don't think so. Didn't they just close down a big nuclear plant in California? So I just it's interesting, and I think I mean it's interesting. It's interesting, but it's also like I think it's the big clash. I really think this is the biggest issue that they have to contend with in this push to get rid of natural gas, especially when natural gas is a cleaner source of energy than coal or oil.
Right. So you get rid of natural gas, and then you have to either go build a bunch of solar and wind farms, right? Because if you want to be consistent, or you just import the coal from Wyoming. Did you hear Biden's State of the Union speech the other night?
I'm going to admit that I was watching the Celtics game instead. So.
You're smarter than me. Well, actually, I missed it that night. I watched it the next day, but I'm almost positive. A listener, you happy to fact check me here, that he said that if the U.S. were to fix its problems as far as emissions, it wouldn't do anything. We only contribute 15%.
So, if you look at the UN emissions gap report, which I actually had up on my computer until I closed it to try to get it to run a little bit better before the podcast. So per capita, so US is definitely responsible for a lot of emissions, but our per capita emissions have been trending downward for a
Right.
while now, even when we weren't in the Paris Climate Accord, and they're continuing to trend downward. So when you look at it that way, and then you look at places like India and China where their per capita emissions are going upward, it's like, so San Francisco decides to do this, but it won't actually do anything on the global scale. They can spend $5 billion to transfer their natural gas powered homes to electricity, but what if the power plant is running on natural gas?
Mm.
Then you're definitely not going to be making a difference. And then even if it's not, the total amount of emissions that you're saving here is not a non-impact on the global scale. Remember, you can do whatever you want individually, but it's the global climate. Remember, we're all in it together.
Yeah.
So like it's like they're not going to like stop the wildfires or something.
Well, and that was what was so funny to hear Biden say that we aren't really the problem. It's China and India. I think he said India as well, but China for sure. And that he rejoined the Paris Climate Accords to get them to do what they're supposed to do.
Well, they
It-
haven't issued an NDC. They have they're supposed to issue these like nationally determined commitments or whatever, and Biden's nationally determined commitment is completely out of reality. I mean, if you look at it, we'd have to stop selling all gasoline powered cars and light trucks today to meet his goals. So that's obviously not happening. But so where's the pressure to get China to issue its NDC? Where's the pressure to get China to stop building new coal plants? Because that's the biggest thing that will help
John Kerry,
greenhouse gas emissions.
John Kerry, he's over there flying over there to get it done, right?
I saw someone say the other day in a like picture he looked like he'd already been embalmed, which is
That-
kind of an apt description.
yeah,
I'm
no,
sorry.
that's good. I agree. I'm wondering at what
Maybe we
point.
should send AOC and she'll like threaten them with something real. I don't know. Send the real firebrands.
Well, at what point do people finally say, okay, hey, if I mean, because like, so let's just presume that you take the worst climate change model, not 2025, like 2040, and you believe that to be true, right? And at some point, if China and India don't capitulate, then you do have to say, okay, well, we have to quit doing this because we're going to have to rebuild our country based upon these rising sea levels, right? I mean, so if you think that if you really believe this was going to happen, at some point you have to quit saying we're going to cut emissions and start saying, okay, we're going to have to use whatever energy we can to move people inland, build bigger seawalls. Right? You have to build a new grid because people move. Like at some point that has to be what's considered. Now, I don't necessarily mind all that hype and hysteria. I'm just simply pointing out if you do, that at some point you have to start talking about that, and I find it interesting that never gets brought up.
That's a good question. Well, that's why I think it makes you wonder whether they really think this is an actual crisis or not.
Well, no, I mean
Or,
Bill Gates just bought a big house in San Diego last year during the middle of the
Mhm.
pandemic. He was so scared about
Yeah.
San
So
Diego. In case you don't know, San Diego is on the ocean. I don't know if you know that or not. Yeah.
San Diego is, yeah.
It's,
Um,
it's beachfront property too.
Beachfront property.
Let's see here.
Yeah.
I don't know if Fargo here.
Exactly. He's super worried about rising sea levels.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so let's see here. I think it was San Diego. Yeah, San Diego. San Diego. He and his wife paid $43 million for the home in San Diego. So just a little
Wow.
and it is it's nice. It's on the water.
So
There it is.
so here's the big question.
Mhm.
Does it have a natural gas hookup? I mean, let's
Oh,
get real. What is the carbon climate impact of this
well,
house?
you know what he says in his book, right? In his
He
book,
buys
he
offsets.
buys offsets because him offsetting is not really practical.
Well, remember what we learned last week, which is that apparently Tesla has been or underestimating or they didn't account for emissions in the coating that they use on their cars. And so now if you've been buying Tesla offsets, you should go out and buy some more offsets because the coating on the cars had more emissions than you thought. So you need to go buy more.
Oh, it never ends.
This is the world we live in.
Never ends. Oh gracious. Okay, let's see here. Let's move on before I have a coronary. Surging oil profits could actually be good for the clean energy race. It's always interesting when prices get high because there is a debate over what becomes more affordable and whatnot. I remember back when 2016, when oil was $100 a barrel, people were saying, "Oh man, this is good because it makes renewables more competitive." And it's like, okay, well, there's nothing for that. Do you buy into this narrative, Miss Wall? Because to me, it really feels like what makes renewables competitive is the top down pressure more than anything else.
Yeah, I gotta say also I apologize to readers because I usually try to pick articles that aren't behind a paywall, and I thought this one wasn't, but now that I'm trying to like refer to it, apparently it is behind a paywall. So oh well. Yeah, I thought this was interesting because all the big oil companies have been posting their earnings, and it's looking pretty good for them. And one of the interesting things I thought that we saw that about BP, which was the first oil company to issue its earnings last week, and they beat analyst expectations by a good amount. And BP's been extremely vocal about basically like we're not an energy company anymore, or we're not an oil company anymore.
Right.
We're a modern energy company, and we're buying wind farms. And what was interesting is that the CEO Bernard Looney tried to paint the earnings as like vindication or say like it's our green portfolio. And if you actually look at what it was that brought in all those earnings, it was two things. One, the price of oil, and two, their trading unit. Like their oil and gas trading unit just made money. And the same thing with Shell, which has also been a big like we now are a green company, green portfolio. We're actually like an energy transmission company or whatever. And Shell has a very aggressive oil trading unit. And so they tried to kind of paint this as vindication of their green strategy when in fact it's not actually at all. And I think that's interesting. Exxon didn't really try to do that, which is not surprising from Exxon, and neither did Chevron. And I did find a piece that kind of goes into Exxon and or Chevron's plans for the Permian, which I thought would be interesting. But in terms of the green stuff, I think it's definitely the top down pressure that makes them so-called competitive without it. And every time I see an article, it's like the cost of this is this or that. I'm like, okay, but if you take away all the government subsidies and
Mhm.
just remember, it doesn't actually generate as much electricity as burning fossil fuels does. So for everything, like it's always, they're always trying to present it in a way that makes it seem better than it actually is. Like the costs have come down 5 times in the past couple of years, and you're like,
Mhm.
okay, but what are you actually getting for that?
Mhm.
And I'm not like against renewables. I just don't think that the party is as good as you're saying it is. It's like they're pitching some like amazing party, and you get there and it's like a bunch of people standing around a bowl of chips.
And they're all double dipping. Just it's it makes it worse. Well, you mentioned the kind of the cloak and dagger stuff. I think that probably is the most frustrating thing is that, we're like, okay, energy as an energy agnostic, I don't really care. It's what's the best for different situations. But it requires so much work to figure that out. That's what becomes frustrating. It's like, okay, well, is this right? Is this wrong? What's being subsidized here? How you determine all this stuff? And you spend a lot of time actually trying to decipher it. And the other thing is, from the top down pressure, I heard Kevin O'Leary the other day talk about how he doesn't have like Schlumberger in any of his portfolios anymore because banks and institutional investors were calling him up saying, why aren't these groups in here? And he said, they're making money now. They're not making as much money, but it's kind of easier to cut them out because they're not really a great company. A, but B, the ESG angle is making him pull out. And so, you have kind of. I think we all agree that if the profits were crazy, ridiculous Tesla type growth stock profits, the narrative would change somewhat. But the profits aren't great, and so then you have these big institutional investors go, "Why is that in your portfolio?" And they're using ESG as kind of the um the way to put pressure on folks, and folks are like, whatever, I can go make money somewhere else in Tesla stock that's really crazily overvalued, but whatever. So,
ESG is like, I really think it's the biggest bubble. It's going to be they're creating a bubble by like pressuring people to go into these things, and it doesn't even really, like, while they're like employing or not employing, they're using slave labor in Africa,
right.
and that doesn't help your I think, right? Social.
Okay, so here we go.
So
This is a tweet from March 3rd, 2021. America's biggest ESG funds has no direct investment in renewable energy companies. Yes, you read that right. And that is from um, Billy Bailey, who is PM at Saltstone Capital. And so I found that to be an interesting tidbit. I mean, okay, is that necessary?
very interesting. Maybe we should do like a longer like kind of dive into all this ESG stuff
Yeah. Well, I mean,
if the listeners are interested.
will Bill Gates have us to his mansion on the oceanfront property in San Diego?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, seriously, I don't understand. If you read some of Gates's stuff, how does one buy a $43 million mansion if you're really worried about the ocean? Like, so you could say, well, for him, $43 million is not a lot of money, and that is true. As weird as that sounds, but the symbolism of it, like if he were to buy in Kansas, and he's like, listen, the sea levels are rising, we might not make it. I'm going to move to Kansas, and so I'll be safe. At least then you could say, okay, well, I can kind of halfway. I don't think he's telling the truth still, but it makes sense. I'm sure he would say that he's trying to put forth a brave face and all this nonsense, but it's just weird that how many people are afraid of the sea levels rising continue to live on the coast. They don't move inland.
Yeah, I mean, every time you read an article about like real estate in Miami Beach or something, they're saying that, but people still buy there. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, it's surprising. I mean, what about all the energy intensive costs of having a $43 million? Oh, maybe he doesn't have insurance on it. A lot of like very wealthy people just self insure.
Yeah,
So
maybe so.
maybe he's like, hey, I'm willing to, I'm willing to lose it all to, I don't know, what, a typhoon, tidal wave.
Earthquake just
It's
sloughs it off.
interesting. So long ago, when I was in college, my freshman year, I took a class about environmental. I can't remember what it was even called. But anyway, one of the things that we got to do was we looked at like different housing regulations in earthquake-prone California and in hurricane-prone Florida. And it was really interesting because we discovered that hurricanes are totally unpredictable and can basically go anywhere in Florida. And yet Florida has like a lot of like tiered regulations about how you can build your house based on like where they think a hurricane's going to hit. Whereas California is like much more like you really have a much better idea about where an earthquake could be based because it's much easier to predict in the fault lines, and yet everyone has to have this like one extreme housing standard for earthquakes, and so you end up with like a lot of and also the amount of money that's concentrated in areas that are very environmentally disaster prone is like very, very high. And so it should actually be, the regulation should actually be switched
Right.
if you want to like make the most sense. I have no idea if that's still the case because that was in like 2001. Now everyone knows how old I am. But it was very interesting to see like the incongruity there.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. Talk a little oil. Oil rises 1% as demand hopes bolster sentiment. These headlines sometimes, I swear.
I know.
Oil rose more than 1% on Monday as Chinese economic figures and U.S. vaccination rate pointed to a strong rebound in demand in the world's two largest economies. Despite, this is me editorializing here, despite last week's doom and gloom about India. So
this is basically a headline saying oil went up. We don't know why.
we don't know why, right? It's like why can't we just say that? Like I don't know how many people don't realize I say most time, a lot of times they really don't know why you don't actually know. You're guessing on why you think the market moves. Now, if on Wednesday, we had a 40 million barrel increase in storage and the price drops. Okay, pretty safe to guess then, right? But on a random Tuesday where there's not a lot of news, it's not exactly clear why the price is moving. And I will say this, I think I've told this on the podcast before. I talked to a trader who worked for one of the big companies, one of the big super majors. And what he told me is that what they're trading on is the actual real fundamentals, and a lot of the trading houses that are trading on technicals or whatever, or their data is delayed. So, I don't know what percent, how that makes the percentage of the markets and all that stuff move, but we read, what's the book? We just had the guys on about.
Oh, The World for Sale.
World for Sale, right? So the kind of information that they're getting is a little bit different than what we're reading from the Reuters headlines, right?
Oh yeah, they're in a totally different class. For those who are wondering, here, The World for Sale.
There it is. Yeah, The World for Sale. And so I think that like you said, we look for reasons to ascribe the market moving, and then what we know.
Well, here are my favorite. Just once, I'd like to see a headline that was like oil rises on high frequency trading, something, like something
Right.
like because the machines said so.
Oil rises going to sell off tomorrow. Yes.
Yeah. Well, this was an interesting quote. So, but it's interesting to look at the quotes that they put. Now, in my experience, having been asked by not the people who wrote this article, but people who've written other articles about it, they generally have an idea, the writers going into this. And if you say something that's contrary to like what everyone else is saying, then they just won't print it. Like they just will choose not to print your quote. But this one I thought was interesting because they asked a Rystad energy analyst who says, India jitters are currently stopping oil prices from rising further, which is like totally contrary to what the headline says. She's actually saying prices should be up more, but people are scared about India, so they're not, which is opposite of the headline. She's like, despite the demand downside in India, it's very likely oil will claw back. We're going to claw back to $70 a barrel. Let's see. Somebody else said the technical picture continues to suggest that oil's price recovery remains intact. So that's basically saying things are staying the same, right? I don't know. I think they've mastered the ability to like not actually say anything. What's interesting about India is we don't actually know yet whether it's impacting demand. I think I saw there was a tweet thread by a different Reuters guy, David Gaffin, I think, where he kind of tried to do a dive into some of the mobility data in India, which is interesting, but also I think it's important for everyone to remember that mobility data is flawed. Remember last year when when a bunch of traders like lost a huge amount of money based on mobility data that was flawed because it ended up being searches people were doing as opposed to actual like miles traveled. So they thought that mobility was a lot higher than it actually was.
Mhm.
So I would just, I always take that with a grain of salt.
Well, and that's what I'm talking about with like the guy that used to work for the big major. Like they're not trading on search data. They actually know how much oil is being moved from A to B and so forth. Whereas these other groups are trying to guess by looking at this mobility data and stuff like that. And so I think you kind of have a discrepancy there. As far as India goes, I do know there is talk of a vaccine that could potentially get approved over there that could help some of their stuff. Of course, you got to get it out and get it rolling and all that stuff. So you're still still a little bit of a ways out, even if that happens.
We also have to remember that India is a massive country. It's a huge country, so what you're hearing is like from one place. It's not
Mhm.
from everywhere. Like you're hearing about Delhi. Well, like what's happening in the rest of the country is not like what's happening in Delhi is not necessarily what's happening in the rest of the country and may not even be impacting mobility. So I think that like India is not like England. It's a very it's like saying, I mean, it's almost more like the United States. Like, well, California was like hard lockdown over the summer, and Florida was like, hey, everybody go to the beach.
Right.
You can't say that like you can look at California and say, oh, everywhere in the United States is like that.
Right. Exactly.
So
Okay.
I think it's the same thing or
Agreed.
similar.
Well, and also as we talked about before, it's their per capita use is so small that it takes a longer time to have a more sustained impact. Whereas if the U.S. were to have a massive outbreak in California or New York and were to shut down one of those, or Texas, one of the big
Yeah.
populous states, we were to shut down, you would see a pretty uh, substantial impact in the oil market because of just the per capita use is so much higher. Whereas
Oh
within
yeah.
it takes a longer time before you can see that. Okay, let's see here. U.S. denies any deal with Iran to ease sanctions or swap prisoners. Miss Wald,
Mhm.
can we just? I'm tired of the Iran story. Like,
I know.
it's like, what's the show when we were growing up? As the World Turns, or what was those other shows they used to have on the soaps? I don't remember
The
the name.
Young and the Restless.
Young and Restless, yes,
The ones you got to watch when you were homesick from school.
yes. And you would turn it on, you'd be like, "What's
Did
this?"
anything happen from the last time I turned it on 5 months ago? Oh,
Exactly.
wait, this person's been replaced by a new actor, and he's
Yeah.
actually a evil twin, but other than that
Like, that's what this story feels like. It's just I don't like nothing ever happens, but we talk about it quite often.
that's so true. It's like, yeah, it's like some people the characters have been the actors playing the roles have been replaced. Like, there's a new
Right,
guy doing the
right,
negotiation, but he looks surprisingly like the old guy.
right. I guess for me, the Iran story it's one of those stories to where, and maybe I'm overstating the case here, but it feels like from the U.S. side of things, we overinflate the Iranian place in the world, and it kind of goes back to George W. Bush's axis of evil when you had Iraq,
Mm.
Iran, and then all of a sudden North Korea. Like it's like okay, I'm not sure how North Korea ties into these two, but whatever. Um, eh, Iran, they're a marginal player in the world. Of course, they have oil reserves, so that gives them an elevated status. Without that, they're an irrelevant nation. I'm not trying to be rude. They're just not a relevant player. Why do we make such a big deal? Like the perpetual fear of Iran is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Worse than Russia,
I
it really is.
I actually think it goes back even before George W. Bush. I think it goes back to the 70s, and the Iran
Right,
hostage
right, right.
situation was like such it was like and the oil shocks also, or even earlier than it was had such a huge impact, I think, on the American like psyche that it really makes Iran into such a huge player when it's really like a middling regional player. But we played it up so much, like they took our hostages, like they took our people hostage and they held them, and like it, I think it was such a it played so large in the American mind, like the idea of it. Um, like I read this book a while back. It was about like it was about like portrayals of the Middle East in like media and movies and things like that. And it's really interesting how big a role Iran kind of came to play in like movies and boogeymen and things like that. So I think it's bigger than just a geopolitical oil thing. It's also like a societal kind of cultural thing as well. And I think it's like, why can't we just like quit Iran, right?
Well, and we helped them overturn switch in the 50s, didn't we? Help them overturn one.
Yeah, we were like helpful-ish,
Right.
maybe. I mean, it's interesting. So Mossadegh was, I don't know. The whole thing was like if the Shah had actually been more powerful, Mossadegh probably wouldn't have allowed Mossadegh to take so much power, but he did, and then Mossadegh started to just completely lose it, like really lose it as well. And so there were more forces at play than just like the US fomented a coup. Like it was much more complicated than that. And the British were also involved, and we were involved because of the British. And the coup wasn't like exactly as big as we thought, like as it's been played up. So it's,
You take
I
away
don't
from nuclear energy is blame the Brits. Blame the
know.
Brits.
Yeah, blame the
Blame the Brits.
Brits.
For Big Orange, we're blaming you.
Yeah, we blame the Brits.
Blame the Brits.
I mean,
Yes.
look, if the CEO of what was the precursor to BP hadn't just been so damn stubborn and had been willing to renegotiate the oil concession with the Iranians in the early 50s, then we wouldn't have been in that situation. So there.
Yeah. Well, so you have that, and then you have the stuff in the 70s and the 80s, obviously. And then, but it's the last, it seems since the war on terror has begun, we've really
Oh
amplified
yeah.
Iranians' spot in the world. And again, I think the Russia stuff, it drives me crazy too. But at least with Russia, they were like the number two country for a period of time. Like you at least have some recent precedent here to be concerned, even though that's overhyped. The Iran stuff, to me, it's like, God, like why do we keep making this have to be a big deal? So what are we gonna
It's
do?
important to have a bad guy.
Well, we got we got plenty of it. Seems we're always looking for some. According to Biden, there's Al Qaeda everywhere. We didn't talk about the fact we supported Al Qaeda in some countries, whatever.
Of course
But
not.
or ISIS, or whatever one was. Anyways, so what's your take? We're gonna do anything with Iran? This is gonna
Yeah, I think that it's pretty much a given that the oil sanctions are going to the Trump era oil sanctions are going to be gone sooner rather than later. But I think that they're going to make it, the media will make it into a big deal, but that the people who know what's going on in the oil market know that this oil is almost always is almost entirely on the market.
right.
I think Samir at Tanker Trackers was talking about that. He talked about the condensates. He said they actually have a lot of condensates that that are like sitting in ships ready to go. So I think that might hit the market in a significant way, but that it could be more of like a one-time condensates hitting the market. And then, I mean, personally, I think that it will impact the market because we're going to start to see oil that is on the market kind of come out from the shadows. So China is buying this stuff, and apparently they just list it as coming from wherever they did the ship-to-ship transfer. So that could be in the UAE, it could be in Malaysia, it could be in Indonesia, Singapore, and so that's how they have been doing it. It'll come out of the shadows, and it'll be listed as Iran, but it's not really new oil. So it'll be hard to say whether most people realize that if people realize that this oil is already on the market, then we won't see that much of an impact. But if they don't, then we could see like I think we could see a jump, or at least a drop, a short one.
Okay. Well, let's go down to next story. The UAE investment fund to acquire Israeli deep gas project as ties between the two countries strengthen. Okay. Miss Wald, it's good to see the Middle East, peace in the Middle East.
Peace in the Middle East.
Despite
Hey,
the last story, peace in the Middle East. Here we go.
yeah, peace in the Middle East, because when you have the UAE investment fund, I think it's Mubadala investing in Mubadala Petroleum is going to buy a 22% share of the Tamar project, which is an offshore project in the Mediterranean Sea. They're going to pay $1 billion with a future payment of maybe another 100 million on future terms being met. I mean, that's not insignificant. yeah, Israel's gotten really into natural gas production. I think that that this is I think this is really significant because, you know, look, when Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty in the 70s, it was like nothing happened, like it was like we are no longer actively at war with you.
Mhm, mhm.
But there wasn't economic anything, and there's a serious effort, I think, being made to really get involved in the economic opportunity between UAE and Israel. And there's a lot that could be done in the sphere of energy. I actually think this is like the tip of the iceberg in terms of energy cooperation, be it with natural gas investment and drilling, be it with pipelines, or even potentially maybe some collaboration in terms of nuclear energy.
Oh, don't get carried away now.
I
Nuclear.
know, don't
Come
get
on
carried
now.
away.
Come on now. Nuclear. What are you trying to do? You trying to get me excited over here? And
Yeah.
nuclear, that's crazy. Well, yeah, okay. This is something for, oh, I don't know, years on this podcast now. The more cross-border investment that happens, it's weird. It's really weird. The less fighting there is. It's just a really weird how that works. And if you just take like the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and China, the big difference is that the U.S. and Chinese economy right now is far more intertwined than the U.S. and Russian economies were during the Cold War. And so, our ability to potentially go to war with the Russians or whatever was greater. Of course, we fought proxy wars. With the Chinese, our economies are too intertwined. We just can't, right? It's just not possible. Well, the more the Middle East becomes intertwined, the less likely there are to continually fight each other. I would just throw it out there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the UAE may find that becomes difficult is that there's a lot of like red tape and regulation when it comes to energy in Israel. And like a lot of these projects have had some serious like backups because of like the government and the regulations and rulings from the courts. And so I just wonder if that could possibly maybe turn off some of the cooperation, or if the government will, now that it sees an area like, oh, well, this is a project between, Israel and UAE, will kind of push that regulatory aspect aside and just push it through. I wonder if that might be a byproduct. So it could be interesting. Maybe this is more strategic on the part of the Israelis. You're like, oh, well, if we get the UAE investment, then there's, then it becomes like a diplomatic thing, and so the judges will stop like giving us problems, and they'll
Do,
push
do
push
the
projects
Israelis,
through.
do the Israelis have a government right now?
So that's another question. Yeah, that's like it's like, you know, um, I wanted to have this site, like that would say like, is there an OPEC meeting today? And you can
Right.
go to it and be like, yes, no. Well, has Israel recently held a national election? Like
Right.
they hold what? Yeah, I think they're in some sort of like temporary thing, and if they don't form one, then yeah. They
I
just the
don't.
problem is they keep holding these elections, and it keeps yielding like the same results, which is that Netanyahu's party gets more than anybody, but not really a plurality. Like they don't actually get a majority, so they wind up in the same space that they have been, and nobody else can form a government either. So they end up with these like temporary governments, and then do elections, and nothing is actually changing.
I don't follow their politics that closely, but it seems like either A, I turn on and yet Netanyahu's in some kind of scandal, or B, they're voting, and so it's like I'm
Yeah.
not sure
Oh yeah.
what's
Oh
going
yeah.
on.
They have like, if you want to study like the most interesting parliamentary system, like that, they have it. Like I mean, they've got, like the party whose purpose is for the legalization of marijuana. Like they've really perfected the like multi-party.
Yeah,
They're
we got
constantly forming new parties. Old parties are dead. New parties form. It's like if you're interested in parliamentary like this, Israel is like,
where to go, huh?
oh yeah,
I mean, based upon our current two-party system, I might have to do some studying.
yeah.
Okay, let's see here. Two more stories. Oh, real quick on the wood burning story. So I did find it.
Ah,
Now I don't know why I just read it yesterday. This is from February 21st, so it was in my feed somehow. But anyways, and it's from the BBC, and it says that owners of wood burners, stoves, and open fires will no longer be able to buy house coal or wet wood under a ban rolled out from next year.
Okay.
So
I'm assuming wet wood is like a thing, not just like wood that is wet.
yeah, you can't spray. Yeah, it's not about getting your water hose and spray the wood. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah, so some kind of big Oran can tell us later. But it's some
Explain,
kind of
please.
anyway. So yeah, so those are that was the story I was referencing. It's from February. I just read it yesterday. I don't know how I got delayed on my end, but there it is. So for those of you who were anxiously waiting, okay. Now this sounds like a Dr. Wald title, but it's not. I don't think. Sorry, Aramco. Reliance just isn't that into you. So this is from the Economic Times of India, right? Yeah, India.
Yeah, it's a reprint actually of a
Mhm.
opinion piece from a guy who writes for Bloomberg named David Fickling, who I happen to know a little bit. He lives in Australia, but he's interviewed me for stuff about Aramco before. Um, nice guy. But so this is actually his opinion, which is, but I don't know if you read the title or not, but I think that's a great title.
Oh yeah, it's a great title. Yeah,
Excellent title.
that's what I said. It sounded like a title that you would have been.
Yeah, I wish I could. I wish I could only come up with titles that good. Um, so what's interesting. So he's talking about the deal, the Aramco deal with Reliance, with Indian refinery Reliance, which I've been kind of wondering what was going on with that, especially given the fact that there was that little kind of tiff between Saudi Arabia and India, where India was like, sell more oil, we need more oil, cheaper prices, and Saudi Arabia was like, no, we don't think so, and also you can just use the stuff that we sold you at really low prices earlier. So I was kind of wondering whether that was going to have and India was like, okay, fine, but we're just not going to buy more Saudi oil. We're going to go buy oil from Guyana and the US and Brazil instead. And then they did to some extent. So I thought it would be interesting to see if like what was happening with that deal where Aramco wants to invest in Reliance refineries because it's the way Aramco does it is they invest in these refineries, they get a portion, and they also get these long-term deals for their oil. So it would be another a good contract. But apparently, according to this, Reliance Industries has been dancing the quadrille with Saudi Aramco for nearly 2 years. And let's see. The two companies would initially exchange shares with cash payments from the Saudis over subsequent years, make up the balance of the transaction. So that's what they've been talking about. I think he was kind of considering is Reliance really looking for a stake in Aramco? I don't think so, honestly.
But China,
China, yes, but I don't. Right, we know that it's China. I don't think that Reliance wants to actually do that.
but if you're real quick, if you're Reliance, wouldn't you want to get in if China's getting in?
Maybe, but if you're Reliance, do you really want to own Saudi Aramco? It just doesn't seem
Well,
like a good. Well, okay, so
they
let's see what this says. What has Reliance's balance sheet. Okay, investments from Alphabet Inc. and Facebook Inc. into its because remember, Reliance isn't just a refinery; it's like a big conglomerate.
Yeah,
Bought in 2.2 trillion rupees last year. That left the company effectively with a net cash position in December. A breakneck pace of growth at Geo would likely cause it to overtake petroleum and chemicals as the biggest contributor to earnings, with or without a stake sale. Right now, the CEO isn't particularly in need of cash. He doesn't need shares in Aramco. Yeah, I agree. Least of all when they're locked up on a foreign stock exchange in a currency whose longstanding dollar peg is looking less secure than once it. Okay, I think that's wrong. I don't think that the real's pegged to the dollar is less secure than it once was. I disagree with that. I do agree that you don't necessarily want to get shares in Aramco that are locked up in a foreign exchange that's highly manipulatable by the government. Yeah, people love to throw around this like, oh, well, the Saudis will unpeg their currency from the dollar, and I think that's an empty threat that the Saudis make.
So what do you think? What's really on the China by the Aramco?
I think it's all in the China. That's like, I don't think there's any way that China would do it if they don't get a board seat or something big. Like they'll want a board seat or they'll want inside information or something like that. I don't think it's worth it to them
So am I
without
reading this
that.
right? 1% would be $19 billion.
Yeah.
They could get a board seat on this podcast for $19 billion. They get all the board seats.
Wow. Yeah, but that's the thing. Do you really want to let the Chinese in on your board meetings? I mean, this is Saudi Arabia. Like this is Aramco. This is the most secretive company, or one of the most secretive companies in the world. No longer the most secretive company, but it was. You really want to give the Chinese government a seat on your board? Do you really want to let them see where the bodies are buried or where the oil's buried?
Well, it wouldn't be the oil; it would be the technology, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's a good point. So, we have a question here from a listener, real quick. A little off topic here, but have you seen the latest from Buffett? Want 8 billion gas plants in Texas to help the grid. I saw the headline, but I haven't read anything beyond that. Have you?
I saw the news. I think it's interesting that he's determined that he thinks that that's what will help Texas, though, because I thought we all had a pretty good idea that the issues in Texas were weren't necessarily related to the fact there weren't enough natural gas power plants. It was more that they weren't outfitted properly, or there were too many that were offline at that point in time. So.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, Buffett. I'm always his energy plays are always interesting because he has big. He owns those railroads, but then he also has some pipelines, and so I'm not really sure what he's angling at with his energy stuff. So I did see
you can be assured that the goal of it is not to help Texas. The goal of it is to make money for Warren Buffett.
That you can't be sure of,
as it should be.
As it should be, right? Nothing wrong with that. So. Okay, final story of the day. We touched on this, I think, a little bit earlier, but we'll wrap up here. Evron. There's your name. Evron.
There you go. That's the Texas Chevron merger.
Evron.
It's just been announced on this show.
Yeah, that's copyrighted, in case you're wondering. Small fee. Exxon Chevron put Permian in cruise control. Exxon and Chevron have big, medium-term growth plans for the Permian Basin, but both are not ready to open the floodgates just yet. Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
I thought it was interesting because they're showing here's what their capex is, but they will drill more later. So someone actually tweeted to me, he wanted to know what my opinion was about Mohammed bin Salman kind of gave his view of where the oil market's going, because everyone does that these days, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, what are your thoughts on the Crown Prince's view on oil market in the next few decades? He says demand will increase and the supply of Russian and USA will decrease significantly. So I was like, well, I do think that demand will increase. I'm not sure that supply from Russia could decrease, but you can't be sure of it because they could always find more oil. Mm. But also from the US, I think we're in for a decrease in the short term. But if you look at this in the long term, they foresee having more money to put into capex. So we'll be in a place maybe for a year or two where they're not really, we're not seeing an expansion. But then, if you look at this, they affirm plans to hit 1 million barrels of oil equivalent by 2025. So they clearly have long-term plans to expand production and expand capex. So I don't think that if you're talking about the next 2 years, maybe, but if you're talking about the next 5 to 10 years, unless we have some sort of major invention and oil becomes obsolete. But
that's not happening. Well, I think in the US, the question is, this year will kind of be a good way to kind of follow this along for now. But price right now with WTI is at $64.50, which is a good price for the shale producers by and large. But we're not seeing the drill baby drill, right? That's still not the narrative. And
not until 2025.
Not 2025.
Then we'll have drill baby drill.
Yeah, and so Dr. Foreman was saying that if we're not careful by the end of the year, the demand will severely outpace the supply and the prices could rise. I'm not sure. We'll see. But the question we talk about ESG is how much money is afraid to enter the market because the margins aren't there as there are in other sectors. And then you can use ESG as a way to pivot out. So Could you have high prices but still not a lot of drilling activity, except for the majors in the Permian? Because some of these smaller groups can't just raise money.
I think you could, but I think that then gives the majors a bigger opportunity to increase production when they want, as the prices,
Right.
want. So, I mean, what would be interesting is that could lead to basically a price floor, in a sense. Say
Well,
we have a price floor of like $60.
right.
The prices never really get below that because the money isn't there for the little guys, and you've got a bunch of like six big guys or big-ish guys running the show, and they're all operating along the same kind of lines, as opposed to everybody's just producing to make payroll.
Right. No, I think that's something that it could be potentially better for the price. I don't know if it'd be better for the industry, right? So you got a lot of jobs that are dependent on it, and so
Yeah.
validation. So it's one of those things. We'll see how it shapes out, but that's definitely something. And I think we were kind of heading there.
Yeah.
It might have just 2020. I think 2020 did a lot of things, and expedited that is one of them for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was like the big it did what Naomi wasn't able to do.
Yes, exactly. Okay, Dr. Wald, I guess that is it for today. Let's see here. I want to say, oh, I know. I got to reach out to the guest. I just reach out to. So we don't have a guest. I guess Dr. Foreman will be on next week or week after. I don't see anything. But we're back next week. So
Yeah.
anything else before we get out here today?
I don't know. I am going to be on with my regular column on investing.com on Thursday, and I'll probably be talking a little bit about Aramco's earnings, which are going to be released tomorrow. So catch me there if you're interested.
Alrighty. Well, we will be back next week.